In the quiet suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nina Reynolds and her 8-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, arrived in their new neighborhood with hope and a cautious optimism. Moving from a bustling, diverse city to a predominantly white neighborhood, Nina and her husband, Darnell, had dreamed of offering Aaliyah the best educational and social opportunities. They envisioned a life free from the distractions and dangers of the city, one where Aaliyah could thrive and explore her curiosities without limitation. For the Reynolds family, this was a fresh start, a chance to find peace and community. Aaliyah's first day at her new school was a flurry of excitement and jitters. She was eager to make friends and explore the expansive playground she'd seen from the road, with its bright swings and the towering jungle gym. Nina and Darnell watched with pride as she stepped onto the school bus, her backpack nearly the size of her small frame. The bus driver, Mr. Ben Miller, was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a pleasant smile. To all appearances, he was gentle and welcoming. With one hand, he tipped his hat, greeting Aaliyah with a grandfatherly warmth that set Nina's mind at ease. As the bus pulled away, Nina felt a wave of relief. This small neighborhood seemed like a cocoon, one where Aaliyah could safely spread her wings. Little did they know that their life in Tulsa was about to veer into a series of events that would reveal a sinister side to this seemingly perfect community. Days passed, and the routine of school days became familiar. Aaliyah's first few days were filled with stories of new friends, lunchtime antics, and classroom activities. Yet, as the weeks wore on, Nina began to notice subtle changes in Aaliyah. The sparkle in her daughter's eyes had started to dim, her once excited recounting of the school day replaced by a hesitant silence. Nina's concern grew, but Aaliyah, when gently probed, simply shrugged off her mother's questions. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Darnell picked up on Nina's growing unease. Aaliyah's normally chatty demeanor had become muted, and her eyes seemed to dart away when her parents asked about her day. Nina and Darnell exchanged a knowing look, their unspoken fears beginning to simmer beneath the surface. The seed of doubt had been planted, but they reassured themselves that adjusting to a new school and new friends could be overwhelming for any young child. However, Nina couldn't ignore her instincts, and each passing day weighed on her. Her maternal intuition whispered that something was amiss, something deeper than the usual challenges of a new environment. Determined to uncover the truth, she began to watch for patterns in her daughter's behavior, her mind running through endless scenarios and questions. Why did Aaliyah seem to retreat into herself? What was she not saying? As the days slipped into weeks, Nina's concerns for Aaliyah only deepened. Aaliyah had become withdrawn, often choosing to retreat to her room after school, avoiding the family's usual evening chatter. Nina noted how Aaliyah's once vibrant enthusiasm had dulled into a quiet resignation, her small shoulders slumping as she climbed off the bus each afternoon. One day, Nina spotted a faint bruise on Aaliyah's wrist as she reached for her glass at the dinner table. Aaliyah noticed her mother's gaze and quickly tugged her sleeve down, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Nina's heart clenched at the sight. She wanted desperately to press for answers, to hold her daughter close and assure her that she could share anything with her parents. But Aaliyah's guarded expression stopped her. Nina sensed that if she pushed too hard, Aaliyah might withdraw even further. Darnell, too, was troubled by the changes he saw in his daughter. He had always taken pride in the close bond he shared with Aaliyah, often spending their weekends at the local park, teaching her how to ride her bike or toss a baseball. But now, even his gentle invitations to play were met with polite refusals, and he was left watching as his little girl grew more distant with each passing day. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Darnell brought up his concerns to Nina. He confessed that he, too, had noticed Aaliyah's strange behavior, but he couldn't make sense of it. Together, they resolved to keep a close watch on her, hoping that in time she would feel comfortable enough to open up. But a nagging dread lingered in the back of Nina's mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were overlooking something crucial. Their quiet observations continued, with Nina's watchful eyes trained on Aaliyah each morning as she boarded the school bus. She began to notice small details, the way Aaliyah hesitated before stepping onto the bus, her shoulders stiffening when she caught sight of Mr. Miller, the bus driver. Though Mr. Miller continued to greet Aaliyah with his usual smile, Nina sensed a subtle change in his demeanor, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Nina was startled by the sound of the school bus arriving home earlier than usual. She hurried to the front door, only to find Aaliyah waiting at the curb, her face ashen and her hands clenched into fists. When Nina called out to her, Aaliyah's expression briefly flickered with fear before she forced a shaky smile and walked up the driveway. Nina's instincts flared with alarm. She crouched down, attempting to coax a response from Aaliyah, but her daughter merely shook her head, mumbling something about wanting to be alone. Without another word, Aaliyah retreated into the house, leaving her mother standing on the porch, a storm of worry churning in her chest. That evening, after Aaliyah had gone to bed, Nina approached Darnell, her voice low and filled with worry. She shared her observations about Mr. Miller, her suspicions about the bus rides, and the strange, fearful expression she had seen on Aaliyah's face earlier that day. Darnell listened intently, his own concern etched deep into his features. They both agreed that something had to be done, but neither could decide on the best course of action. Days later, as Nina continued her quiet investigation, she encountered one of the neighborhood mothers at a local grocery store. The woman, Caroline Thompson, was known for her friendly demeanor and gossip about the local happenings. Caroline noticed Nina's worried expression and, after a few polite exchanges, casually mentioned that her own son had refused to ride the school bus anymore. Nina felt a jolt of recognition at Caroline's words. She hesitated before asking if Caroline had noticed anything unusual about Mr. Miller. Caroline's face fell, her expression shifting from friendly to guarded. She looked around, lowering her voice before admitting that her son had mentioned Mr. Miller making odd comments and that he didn't feel comfortable on the bus anymore. When Nina pressed for details, Caroline simply shrugged, unwilling to say more. Returning home, Nina felt a sense of urgency grip her heart. She shared her encounter with Darnell that evening, and together, they weighed their options. Both agreed that they needed to keep a closer eye on Aaliyah and her experiences on the school bus. Nina decided that the next morning she would follow the bus in her car, determined to get a better sense of what her daughter was enduring. The following day, after Aaliyah boarded the bus, Nina slipped into her car, keeping a safe distance as she followed the bus through the neighborhood streets. She watched closely as Mr. Miller made each stop, letting the other children off one by one until Aaliyah was the last remaining passenger. Nina's heart raced as she continued to follow, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The bus took an unexpected turn, veering off the usual route. Nina felt her chest tighten with fear as the bus made its way down a deserted road, lined with dense trees. She held her breath, watching as the bus finally came to a stop. She could just make out Mr. Miller's silhouette as he turned to look at Aaliyah, his posture rigid and intimidating. For what felt like an eternity, Nina watched as Mr. Miller seemed to speak to Aaliyah. She couldn't make out his words, but the tension in Aaliyah's body was unmistakable. Finally, after what seemed like an agonizing wait, the bus resumed its route, turning back onto the main road and heading toward their neighborhood. When Aaliyah returned home that afternoon, her expression was blank, her eyes glazed with a sadness Nina had never seen in her daughter before. As Aaliyah shuffled up the driveway, Nina met her at the door, her heart pounding. Though she tried to conceal her worry with a warm smile, her voice was tense as she greeted her daughter. Aaliyah mumbled a soft hello, slipping past her mother and heading straight for her room. Nina's eyes followed Aaliyah's retreating figure, her mind racing. She felt a chill, an icy fear settling in her bones. She knew she had to confront what was happening, even if she feared the answers. Aaliyah's silent suffering had gone on for too long, and Nina couldn't bear to see her daughter fade any further. Determined, she and Darnell discussed their next steps that evening, agreeing that something had to be done, but both were unsure how to proceed. That night, Nina lay awake, her mind replaying the scene she had witnessed on the road. She could still see Mr. Miller's shadowy figure, leaning toward her daughter, his posture radiating an unsettling authority. Every instinct in her screamed that Aaliyah was hiding something, but the thought of pushing her too hard felt equally terrifying. She needed answers, and she needed to protect her daughter. But a nagging doubt weighed heavily on her heart. What if her concerns were dismissed? They were still newcomers in this community, and the subtle, uneasy glances from their neighbors hadn't gone unnoticed. The next morning, Nina steeled herself as she saw Aaliyah off to school, her voice gentle yet encouraging as she reminded her daughter that she could tell her anything, no matter what. Aaliyah nodded, though her eyes darted away, and Nina could see the fear simmering just below the surface. Once Aaliyah had left, Nina picked up the phone and dialed the school, her hands shaking as she asked to speak with the principal. But the conversation left her more frustrated and powerless. The principal, while polite, brushed off her concerns, reassuring her that Mr. Miller had been a trusted employee for years and had never received complaints. Nina's attempts to convey the distress she'd seen in Aaliyah were met with a carefully worded but dismissive response, leaving her feeling even more isolated. Days passed in a fog of tension and dread, with Nina and Darnell finding themselves increasingly isolated. The few neighbors they had once exchanged pleasantries with now seemed distant, their smiles strained, as though the Reynolds family had become the subject of quiet scrutiny. Nina suspected that her questions about Mr. Miller had stirred whispers in the close-knit community, casting their family as outsiders, stirring unnecessary trouble. But none of this mattered to Nina compared to the fear that gripped her each time Aaliyah boarded that bus. One afternoon, as Nina waited for Aaliyah to return, her phone buzzed with a text from Darnell. He had reached out to a friend, a fellow parent he trusted, who suggested they report their concerns directly to the authorities if they felt Aaliyah was in real danger. Though Nina and Darnell had been hesitant to take such a drastic step, fearing it would only exacerbate their standing in the neighborhood, Darnell reminded her that they couldn't risk Aaliyah's safety for the sake of appearances. So, that evening, as Aaliyah sat quietly in her room, Nina and Darnell placed a call to the local police station, explaining the unusual behavior they had observed in Aaliyah and her interactions with Mr. Miller. They stressed that they weren't accusing anyone without cause, but they felt a responsibility to ensure their daughter's well-being. The officer on the other end listened, his responses cautious but professional, and assured them that a report would be filed. However, he reminded them that without concrete evidence or an incident, there was little the authorities could do. They would, he said, keep a watchful eye. In the days that followed, Nina and Darnell were left in a state of anxious waiting. They tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, even as their hearts remained heavy with worry. Then, one Friday afternoon, as Nina waited by the front window, she spotted the school bus rumbling down the street, a sight that had once filled her with joy, but now only stirred fear. But as the bus stopped, Nina's heart froze. Aaliyah was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through Nina as she frantically searched the bus's windows, looking for any sign of her daughter. The driver's gaze met hers briefly before he pulled away, his expression indifferent as he drove down the street, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk. Without a moment's hesitation, Nina grabbed her phone and dialed Darnell, her voice trembling as she explained that Aaliyah had not come home. Darnell's response was immediate, his tone laced with urgency as he instructed Nina to call the school and the police. Nina's fingers shook as she dialed, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she explained her situation to the school's receptionist, who, despite her sympathetic tone, informed her that school hours had ended and that all buses had returned to the depot. Fear tightened in Nina's chest as the receptionist suggested calling the police. After ending the call, Nina dialed 911, her voice cracking as she recounted the events to the dispatcher, her panic spilling over as she detailed Aaliyah's recent changes in behavior, her fears about Mr. Miller, and the school's dismissive response. The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent to their home, and Nina waited by the window, her hands clasped tightly together as she whispered silent prayers for Aaliyah's safe return. When Darnell arrived home, they stood together on the porch, their arms wrapped around each other, watching the street in tense silence. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, and soon a patrol car pulled up, two officers stepping out to greet them. One officer, a tall, stern-faced man named Officer Thompson, took the lead, asking Nina and Darnell to recount everything they had noticed. From Aaliyah's subtle changes to the encounter Nina had observed between her daughter and Mr. Miller. As they spoke, the officers took notes, their faces grim as they listened to the mounting list of concerns. When Nina finished, she felt both drained and anxious, wondering if her words would be taken seriously or dismissed as the overprotectiveness of a worried mother. But as the officers exchanged glances, she sensed a shift, a growing awareness of the gravity of the situation. Then, as the officers were about to leave, a car pulled up to the curb. Nina's breath caught as she recognized Aaliyah's form stepping out, her usually bright face pale and her posture hunched in a way that made her look smaller, more vulnerable. She walked up the driveway, her gaze fixed on the ground. And when Nina rushed to embrace her, Aaliyah barely responded, her body stiff and unyielding. The officers observed, their expressions darkening as they watched the reunion, understanding dawning in their eyes. As Aaliyah entered the house, one officer pulled Nina and Darnell aside, advising them to sit down with their daughter and try, gently, to understand what had happened. He assured them that if anything serious had occurred, they would have full support from the authorities and that they should not hesitate to contact them again. That evening, Nina sat beside Aaliyah on the edge of her bed, her heart aching as she gently encouraged her daughter to share what had been troubling her. Aaliyah's response came slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words struck Nina with the force of a tidal wave. Aaliyah described the subtle but painful ways Mr. Miller had isolated her on the bus, his quiet, cutting comments that belittled her, making her feel small and out of place. She recounted the times he had driven her off the route, stopping in deserted areas and leaving her feeling vulnerable and frightened. Nina's heart broke as Aaliyah struggled to articulate the fear she had carried alone, the sense of helplessness that had kept her silent for so long. Overwhelmed, Nina held Aaliyah close, her own tears mingling with her daughter's, as she made a silent vow to protect her at all costs. She and Darnell exchanged a look of fierce resolve, knowing that this fight had only just begun. The night felt long and sleepless for Nina and Darnell as they lay in bed, their thoughts racing with anger, guilt, and the resolve to make things right. They couldn't shake the image of Aaliyah's haunted expression, her words echoing in their minds as they struggled to fathom how Mr. Miller, a man so respected by the community, had instilled such fear in their little girl. Darnell's jaw clenched as he replayed each of Aaliyah's accounts, his fists curling with helpless rage. The next morning, they awoke with a shared determination to bring justice to their daughter. Yet the obstacles loomed large. Nina knew that speaking out against Mr. Miller would not be well received in their close-knit community, especially given the thinly veiled racial undertones she had felt since moving in. But none of that mattered now. They couldn't stay silent. Darnell reached out to the school first, requesting a meeting with the principal to discuss the serious allegations against Mr. Miller. However, he was met with a guarded response, a familiar, bureaucratic wall. The principal listened, but deflected, citing Mr. Miller's spotless record and years of service. She urged them to consider the implications before making public accusations that could damage a man's reputation. Frustration bubbled within Darnell as he hung up, his trust in the school shattered. Left with no choice, Nina and Darnell decided to escalate their concerns to the school district. They prepared a detailed report of Aaliyah's experiences, including Nina's observations of Mr. Miller's behavior, and submitted it to the district office. Days passed in tense anticipation, with little communication from the district. The family felt increasingly isolated, their faith in the system dwindling as the days stretched on without any sign of action. Throughout this time, Aaliyah struggled to find her footing again. Though relieved to have unburdened herself to her parents, she remained wary, her innocence chipped away by the ordeal. Her once joyful mornings had turned into somber routines, her laughter dulled as she continued to carry the weight of what had happened. Darnell and Nina watched helplessly, desperate to restore the sense of safety they had promised her when they moved to Tulsa. Then one evening, A knock on their door shattered the quiet tension that had settled over their home. Standing on the porch was Officer Thompson, the officer who had taken their initial report. His expression was serious as he greeted them, stepping inside to speak privately. Officer Thompson revealed that the school district had finally reviewed their report but had found no sufficient grounds to act against Mr. Miller. However, in light of Aaliyah's testimony and Nina's persistent concerns, he informed them that the police department would be opening an independent investigation into Mr. Miller's conduct. He explained that the process would take time, but assured them that their voices had not gone unheard. Though it was a small victory, Nina and Darnell felt a flicker of hope. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Mr. Miller was deeply rooted in the community, and his reputation was a powerful shield. But Officer Thompson's words reignited their determination to see the investigation through, no matter the cost. The following days were a whirlwind of interviews and statements as officers collected information from other families. However, the investigation faced resistance. Some parents refused to cooperate, unwilling to speak against a man who had driven their children for years without issue. Others hinted at suspicions they had harbored but had never voiced, fearful of the social backlash that would follow any complaint against Mr. Miller. Then a breakthrough came when another family, the Martins, approached Officer Thompson with their own troubling experiences. Their daughter, Sophia, had also reported feeling uncomfortable around Mr. Miller, describing how he made disparaging comments under his breath and seemed to single her out with scornful looks. Though they hadn't initially connected her discomfort to something sinister, they realized, after hearing about Aaliyah's story, that there might be more to it. With the Martins' testimony, the investigation gained traction, and more families came forward, emboldened by the Reynolds' courage. Each account added to the mounting evidence, painting a grim picture of a man who had, for years, operated under the radar, his behavior concealed by the respectability of his position. The reports revealed a disturbing pattern. Small, isolated incidents that, when viewed together, told a story of abuse and manipulation. As the investigation unfolded, the neighborhood grew divided. Some rallied behind the Reynoldses, horrified by the revelations and supportive of their pursuit of justice. But others took a different stance, viewing the allegations as an attack on a respected member of their community. Nina and Darnell found themselves the target of whispered accusations and cold stares, with certain neighbors making it clear that they were no longer welcome. One afternoon, as Nina drove through the neighborhood, she noticed a group of mothers gathered at the park, their eyes following her with thinly veiled hostility. When she parked to take a walk with Aaliyah, they pointedly turned their backs, their actions a painful reminder of how quickly a community could turn on its own. But despite the isolation, Nina held her head high, resolved to stand firm for her daughter. At home, Darnell faced similar challenges. Once friendly co-workers now treated him with a wary distance, their smiles strained as they offered brief, uncomfortable greetings. But he refused to let their coldness shake his resolve. He had no intention of backing down, not when Aaliyah's future depended on it. Finally, after weeks of mounting tension and turmoil, the police department completed its investigation, gathering testimonies and documenting every detail. With the evidence in hand, they contacted the district attorney, who reviewed the case and agreed to bring charges against Mr. Miller. The news sent shockwaves through the community, sparking a mixture of outrage and relief. For the Reynoldses, it was a bittersweet victory, a long-awaited validation of their fears, but one that came at a high personal cost. As the trial approached, Nina and Darnell prepared themselves for what lay ahead, knowing that their fight was far from over. They enrolled Aaliyah in counseling, determined to help her heal from the emotional scars she had endured. The process was slow, with Aaliyah hesitant to trust again, but little by little, they saw glimpses of her old spirit returning. In the courtroom, the Reynoldses faced Mr. Miller, who remained stoic and unrepentant, his gaze cold and defiant. The proceedings were grueling, with each day bringing a fresh wave of painful memories, as Aaliyah's story was recounted in meticulous detail. The testimonies from other families served as a painful reminder of the extent of the harm that had gone unchecked for so long. As the trial progressed, the community's divisions deepened, with neighbors taking sides and tensions rising. Some continued to rally behind the Reynoldses, grateful for their courage in exposing the truth. But others remained steadfast in their loyalty to Mr. Miller, viewing the trial as a miscarriage of justice, an attempt to tear down a man they had long respected. In the end, after days of testimony and evidence, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Mr. Miller was sentenced, his years of hidden cruelty finally brought to light. For Nina and Darnell, the verdict was a vindication of their fight, a testament to the strength they had found within themselves to protect their daughter. Yet, as they left the courtroom, they knew that the scars left by this ordeal would linger. Aaliyah's trust had been shattered, and the neighborhood they had once viewed as a safe haven now felt like a battleground. But as they returned home, they were met by a small gathering of supporters, neighbors who had chosen to stand with them, who recognized the courage it had taken to speak out. One mother approached Nina, her eyes filled with remorse as she apologized for not coming forward sooner, admitting that her own child had also experienced uncomfortable encounters with Mr. Miller, but that she had brushed them off out of fear. In that moment, Nina felt a wave of empathy, understanding the weight of silence and the courage it took to break it. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal, slowly and cautiously. The school district implemented new policies, introducing stricter protocols for reporting and investigating complaints. Diversity and sensitivity training sessions were held for school staff, and a new committee was established to ensure the safety and well-being of all students. It was a small but significant step toward a more inclusive environment. For Aaliyah, the journey to healing was a gradual one. Though she still carried the memories of her ordeal, her parents' unwavering support helped her reclaim her confidence. They surrounded her with love, encouraging her to explore her passions and helping her rebuild her sense of trust. As spring bloomed in Tulsa, the Reynolds family found solace in the resilience they had discovered within themselves. They had confronted darkness, standing against a community that had once doubted them, and in doing so, they had emerged stronger, bound by an unbreakable bond of love and determination. Each day, as Nina watched Aaliyah laugh and play, her heart swelled with pride, knowing that their fight had not been in vain. They had uncovered the truth, faced the consequences, and ultimately paved the way for a brighter, safer future for their daughter and every child in their community.